Hey Indian Creek 8th grade students, it's Professor Blazek and I'm here today with part 4 of our series on World War II, and we're going to be looking at the home front. So basically what World War II brought to America, to citizens who did not go overseas and serve in war, and how World War II helped drag America finally out of the final stages of the Great Depression. So there were more than 15 million Americans who joined the armed forces during World War II. Now, this was the greatest number of Americans who had gotten involved in any military conflict up until this time. And for the first time, about 250,000 women served in the war. Now, they did not serve in combat roles, so none of them actually went to the front lines. None of them were trained to fire weapons or operate weapons of war, anything like that. They served more as secretarial positions or nurses, just non-combat roles that could get them involved in the war effort. And this was a major breakthrough for women and the opportunities that they were given in the United States and in the armed forces. And during this time, American industry also shifted to war production. So during the Great Depression, so many American industries had either been made obsolete or at least beaten down, and this was an opportunity for all of these industries, the factories that had been sitting by idly or the workers that had been unemployed. It was an opportunity for all of those things to get involved in the war effort and really show the power that America had when it united behind a single cause, which was fighting the war. So automakers shifted from making cars to making trucks and tanks, and any labor disputes during this time were solved to prevent work stoppages. And so a lot of people could go to work into manufacturing ammunition or food rations or uniforms or weapons, anything to do with the war effort. And this provided the opportunity for all of these workers and all these industries who had really been suffering for over a decade to come out and start to prosper once more. Now, the government would spend over $320 billion fighting World War II. Typical estimates set it close to $350 billion. And this was more money than the U.S. government had spent in its entire history up until this point. So you think about the U.S. government obviously started back in Revolutionary War times, and it would spend more money in the 4 years fighting World War II than it had in the first 160, 165 years of its existence. So this just really shows the dedication to fighting the war and just exactly what effects the attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan had on motivating the so-called sleeping giant that was America. Now, the U.S. would raise this money by selling war bonds, and it also raised taxes on both corporations and individuals. So this was a way that, again, really the whole country would come together to finance this great undertaking. And so you can see there is a poster, one of many examples. It says "Back the Attack." It shows an American soldier. It just tells you to buy war bonds. And so for people who did not serve in the armed forces, buying war bonds was a way to just contribute to the war effort and make sure that the soldiers and the government had what they needed to continue fighting. Now, with any war effort, there needed to be sacrifices made by those people at home. And so, as I mentioned before, industry would soar during this time and finally pull America out of the final stages of the Great Depression. And people who did not serve in the war could still play very important roles in regards to contributing to the war effort. So they could provide food or transportation or medical care that would go to the soldiers and just, again, provide a way for them to continue to have everything that they needed while they were preparing to head off into World War II. Now, automakers would stop making new cars while the United States was fighting World War II. And stockings, for example, were no longer produced because silk was needed for parachutes. World War II saw an entirely new form of combat called the paratroopers, where soldiers would be dropped out of planes above enemy lines. They would parachute down and then begin fighting the war from there. So silk was needed to make those parachutes, which meant that women had to go without stockings because they were made out of silk. And then there were also items like shoes, sugar, gasoline, and meat that would be rationed via coupon booklets. And I have some examples here for you. And so if you look, you can see that each family or each person in America would get these coupon booklets, and they would have rations for example, 5 pounds of sugar, a half unit of gasoline. And so people really had to make these sacrifices because once you used up your coupons, you could no longer get those items that were being rationed. So it helped Americans also learn to save, learn to cut costs, learn to skimp when they could. And again, this would just help reinforce pulling America out of the Great Depression because people were no longer able to spend exorbitant amounts of money on things that they might not necessarily need. So again, just a way for people at home to help contribute to the war effort. Now, I want to also take a look at some of the groups that were involved in World War II that maybe aren't always given the credit that they should be. So as millions of men left to fight the war, many women who did not end up serving in the armed forces would find new work opportunities. And Rosie the Riveter became a symbol for working women during this time because obviously men left a lot of their factory jobs, their manufacturing jobs, and women answered this call incredibly selflessly. And so there's a picture of Rosie the Riveter. You can see she's saying, "We can do it." Very popular, very famous image, one that a lot of you have probably already seen. And this attitude just really embodied how women felt during World War II. Now, even though this would open up many new job opportunities because women could take jobs that they normally weren't given, they still usually made less than men. And when soldiers returned at the end of the war, a lot of these women who had made these sacrifices in working these jobs would lose them right back to the men who had left them. So this was an unfortunate consequence, but you also have to remember that the soldiers who had left them had just gone to serve in war, so in coming back, it was a situation where, honestly, both groups were deserving of having the jobs. It's just unfortunate that most of the time it was women who would lose their job and not have the opportunity to take a new one or a similar one. But this period did change public opinion on women in the workforce, and it would open many new doors for working women because this time showed that women could work these jobs that were, again, typically thought of as male jobs and provided building blocks for women in the workforce moving forward. Now, in looking at another group, African Americans, there were about 1 million African Americans who served during World War II. And as the war began, combat forces in the United States were segregated, so there were white units and African American units. But as the war went on, the armed forces began to desegregate, and African Americans were started to be given combat assignments. And one famous group of African American soldiers was the Tuskegee Airmen. They were a group of African American pilots who served with distinction, who actually shot down over 200 enemy planes. So a very famous, very effective fighting group. So there's a picture of some of the pilots there along with their SEAL. And at home during this time, there were many African Americans who moved from the South to big cities in the North and West in search of work because remember, there were all these new job opportunities. And unfortunately, this would sometimes lead to violent outbreaks as a result of racial tensions between African Americans and whites who were now sort of mixing together for the first time. So an unfortunate consequence of this, to be certain. Now, there were also thousands of Native Americans who served in the armed forces during World War II, and a special group of Navajo were those who made a very, very important impact on the war, because many American radio communications were being intercepted and decoded by the Japanese. And so what these Navajo code talkers did is they created a special code from the Navajo language that the Japanese were never able to break. So now these American communications could be sent without being intercepted, and Marine Major Howard Connor would later say that America would never have won the Battle of Iwo Jima without the code talkers. So this just shows the creativity and the intelligence and the bravery shown by these Native Americans who, as we've seen, were never ever treated with any kind of respect by the American government. And yet during World War II, there was a group of these people who stepped up for their country, who made an incredibly important contribution, again just reinforcing the idea that all Americans came together to fight this war. Now, there were also 300,000 Hispanic Americans who would serve in the armed forces during World War II, and 12 of them were awarded with the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is the highest honor that can be given to a combat soldier. Now, at home, because of the need for labor workers, the United States would also recruit thousands of Mexican workers for our farms and railroads through what was called the Bracero program. And so a lot of immigrants would come up from Mexico, provide this much needed work, and again just contribute to the war effort. Unfortunately, similar to a lot of African Americans, these Mexican Americans would sometimes experience racial tensions and discrimination during wartime. So another minority group making big sacrifices and contributing to the war effort, and unfortunately it was not always met with the amount of respect that it frankly should have been. Now, the last group I want to look at is Japanese Americans, because after the attack on Pearl Harbor, many Americans reacted to Japanese Americans with fear and hatred. You can think about, as a more present-day correlation, you think about the attacks on 9/11 and the treatment of people from the Middle East by a lot of Americans. You know, the sort of off-the-cuff response is to meet all people from this cultural group with nothing but distrust and fear and hatred. And it's very, very unfortunate, but there was just a lot of public pressure. And so what happened was over 100,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast were sent to internment camps, even though 2/3 of them were American born. So even though a lot of these people had been born and raised in America, just the sheer public outrage over the attacks on Pearl Harbor and the resulting widespread distrust led to these people basically being imprisoned. And those who were relocated could only bring what could be carried into camps. They were basically taken from their homes. Whatever you can carry with you, you can bring, otherwise it stays behind. So the majority of people lost a lot of their possessions. And again, this is just very sad, very unfortunate. You can see there the internment camps surrounded by barbed wire. People are just massed in there, and just a very, very sad situation. Now, the conditions in these camps, as you would probably guess, were poor. There was not much food, or at least not much healthy food. Housing was not good. There was rampant disease, and there were armed guards throughout each camp. So Japanese Americans, unfortunately, were just met with a lot of distrust, a lot of fear, and had to go through a very difficult time in the post-Pearl Harbor United States. So that's all I have for you in this video, looking at the war at home and the different groups who were involved in the war effort. I'll be back soon with part 5, where we will be looking at the war in Europe. And until then, this has been Professor Blazek, and I will see you next time.